You're listening to The Nourished Child, episode number 86. Hit it.
Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
If you're a parent, you've experienced emotions, the emotions that your child has, outbursts, temper tantrums, the silent treatment, happy, excitedness. There are a range of emotions we all experience, and they start early in life. Maybe you've got a picky eater that turns into himself when he sees something new on the table, or a child who gets overly excited when spontaneous treats are available, or a child who's nervous and self-conscious, who turns to food to soothe those feelings. We all have emotions, even our children. Understanding those emotions and how they play out in day-to-day life is what today's show is all about. I've got Melanie Smith on the show today. Melanie is the Director of Training for the Renfrew Centers. She's responsible for developing and implementing clinical training and programming consistent with emerging research and evidence-based practice. She provides supervision and consultation to Renfrew staff to continually assess and improve fidelity and competence of treatment of the Renfrew Center Unified Treatment Model for Eating Disorders. Melanie has extensive training and experience in the Unified Protocol for the Transdiagnostic Treatment of Emotional Disorders and is a UP certified therapist and trainer. She's amazing. I first was introduced to Melanie at the Food and Nutrition Conference back in October of 2018. She actually did a talk about emotions. And after I listened to her talk, I thought, I have got to get her on the show. She just had such a great way of explaining emotions that made it really easy for me to understand, and I'm sure you will benefit from listening to her as well. You can find today's interview with Melanie, the show notes, and the links that we mention over on my website at jillcastle.com/086. Before we begin, I want to remind you, if you haven't listened to the last episode on The Nourished Child, I interviewed Jevi Stone, a silver medalist in women's rowing and also an emergency doctor. We talked all about how she trains, what she eats, and how she balances a very hectic life. She is going for the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo, so it's fun to really just get a handle on how she is sort of getting prepared for all of that and how her life has had to change. I think you'll really enjoy that episode. Next episode, number 87, will be me, yours truly, and I'm going to talk about how to help kids try new foods. So I will go over a couple of principles, hopefully that are somewhat new to you. It should be a good episode because I know parents out there are really trying to help their children try new foods. So I'm hoping to give you a little perspective as well as some really good tips you can use. I did get a little podcast review from a listener. I thought it would be fun to share with you. Hi, Jill. I'm a mom in Australia. I started listening to your podcast when my little boy started to be a fussy eater around 12 months of age. I'm a developmental physio and work with lots of speechies and dietitians, and I didn't want to end up down the path of disordered eating. With the support of my colleagues and your podcast, at 20 months, my little dude is really starting to turn a corner. It takes a lot of dedication, preparation, teamwork, and sticking to your guns, but it's achievable. I just wanted to let you know that there is another success story out there so you can reassure people that the process takes time, but works if you stick to it. Thanks again for your help. Kind regards. I love speechies. You can tell she's from Australia. So that's so nice to hear that. I know that it's hard to write reviews of the podcast. It's just hard to stop and go in and type out a review. But this came through email to me, and I just really appreciate getting feedback. It helps me know what's landing with you and what's not. But it really just makes me very happy to know that she is doing better and her son is doing better. I also wanted to let you know that I actually was a guest on another podcast called Mom Brain. And on that podcast, I talk about picky eating. And the co-hosts are Daphne Oz and Hilaria Baldwin. And I can tell you, it was just such a fun conversation. And they had great questions. And it was really just very interesting and fun to go through the whole process of being on their show, because you're live in person in their studio, but also just to talk about picky eating and talk about how I approach things in terms of food and feeding and child development and some different strategies and considerations to consider as a parent. So if you are interested in that show, I will include the link to that show in the show notes for this show. You can find them over at jillcastle.com/086. And then I've been hearing a lot more about food obsession, and I just thought that I wanted to share a response that I gave to somebody who is a follower of the show and my blog. It's a slice of a issue, food obsession, or the appearance of a child who is triggered or obsessed with sweets or candy or treats. It's a challenging situation. I've worked with some families on this, but I think, and here's what I said to this inquiry, I think sometimes what gets missed is the temperament and personality of the child. And we all have to remember as parents that perception is real. If a child feels that there is scarcity, that's going to drive some of the behaviors that you're seeing. If there's been a history of scarcity or restriction, then that needs time and reparation. That feeling of scarcity can also create a mistrust between the child and the parent. And so there needs to be time to repair that mistrust or distrust that the child may have. Discussing the policies or the goals around family nutrition can also be very powerful in helping children understand the framework that they're living in. And this doesn't mean that you're restricting them, but you're sharing your family mantra, your family beliefs, the family dietary or nutrition balance you want to strike. And when sometimes we state this or we say that this is our goal as a family to eat this way, children can, adopt that as part of their own decision-making process. The other thing when we talk about food obsession is to remember that some children are more food responsive. We have research about this. They're born more food responsive. And it's not clear cut how to manage this in children like this who have like a genetic component to it. I do feel optimistic with these children. I feel that, we have to try different things and we have to see what works without causing more damage or causing further obsessions. I use the 90-10 rule. 90% of what kids eat is healthy growing foods based in the food group. 10% can be fun foods. That's a tactic. That's just a tool. It's just one tool. It may not be the solution. The division of responsibility is a philosophy and also a strategy. But again, it's one tool that can be powerful, very powerful, but it may not work alone in every situation. As a practitioner and a parent myself, I really do believe you need to have an arsenal of tools and strategies and some flexibility in your back pocket to allow you to tap into different tools and strategies with your children. Sometimes things do work and sometimes they're a flop. And so you have to have more than one tool to address what you might be seeing as a food obsession. I think also if you're a healthcare professional, and this is something that's happening with your own child, for example, I think we have to acknowledge that, as a healthcare person or a healthcare professional, we are always going to be more responsive to our children and their behaviors around food or their behaviors around their health, which can complicate the picture as well. So I just wanted to sort of share some thoughts about food obsession because I'm hearing, again, a lot more talk about this. And so There's no one solution. There's no one tool to address it. I think there's a lot of different things, a strategy for feeding, a food system in the home that supports healthy, nutritious eating, but also allows for indulgent foods as well. Navigating that with your child, talking about food balance, what the family beliefs and goals are for eating and health. It's a multi-layered thing. So if you're out there and you feel like you've got a food-obsessed child and you're at a loss for things, I encourage you to go to my blog and read about food obsession. I know my colleague Marianne Jacobson has some articles on food obsession. Ellen Satter also addresses it in some of her articles. So there are pieces of information out there for you to tap into. And of course, there's always professional help as well. And there are many, many pediatric nutritionists out there who can be of help to you if you feel that you're really at a loss with your child. So now let's get on to the show with Melanie Smith. We are talking about the science of emotions and eating. Here's Melanie.
Hi, Jill. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. I saw you speak in October at the Food and Nutrition Conference and Expo, and I immediately thought, I have got to have her on the podcast. I was just very interested in your presentation about negative emotions, and it really got me thinking about how that influences children, even at a really young age, but mostly in their development throughout childhood, how that can really color how they connect their emotions to eating and how that influences their functionality around eating. But before we get into all of those details, why don't you tell listeners who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so it was kind of serendipity that we met at the American Dietetics Association conference because I am not a dietitian. So it was probably unusual for me to be on the program there, as I am a licensed mental health counselor. So my background is in counseling and psychology, not necessarily in nutrition. However, for the last 11 years, I've worked with patients with eating disorders at a eating disorder treatment center called the Renfrew Center. So really, my focus has been on the psychology and emotionality of eating and weight control behavior, essentially, for all of that time, which is what brought me to the American Dietetics Association conference, because we thought it was really important that dietitians really have a good understanding of the emotional connection between eating behavior and our emotions. So that was kind of the point of that. So this is kind of an ideal marriage for me.
Yeah, I think so too. And like I said, it really resonated with me because I do work with children and have for a long time. And emotions come into the scene quite a bit. And a lot of times nobody wants to talk about those, not in my setting anyways. We're dealing with the outcomes, obviously, of the emotions and the eating behaviors that have sort of evolved over time. But let's explore the emotional connection to eating. What can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. Well, there's an emotional connection to essentially everything we do, eating and otherwise. When we are feeling not our best selves, when we're feeling sadness, when we're feeling anxious, fear, shame, disgust, any of those experiences that all of us as human beings have, we do things behaviorally to respond to them. So one of the many things we could potentially do is either eat or not eat in response. So, I mean, everyone's certainly very familiar with the old adages of like eating my feelings and eating emotionally. And those are things that we all do, whether we have an eating disorder or not, because food certainly and the experience of eating can be very soothing and very satisfying, which is a good thing to some extent, but it's not a good thing if we develop a pattern where we learn that the only way we can soothe ourselves and regulate our emotions is by eating. The reverse is also true. As far as people who are feeling, again, all of those same difficult emotions to experience might then not want to eat. They might want to be numb from their emotions. And a good way, a very effective way of being numb to your emotions is actually not nourishing your body and being pretty numb and restricting your intake.
I imagine these emotions start from birth, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So take us through the evolution of how one develops their emotional regulation.
Right. So from the minute we come out of our mother's womb, we are experiencing emotions, even though we don't have a good language for it in very early ages to be able to express it. We certainly express it in our behaviors. So babies cry, babies scream. I mean, you've seen, and you can tell the difference between a baby cry that's an angry cry or that's like a sad or a scared cry. So we have those experiences very early on. And when we're thinking of young children, it's really important as parents and as professionals to be teaching them an emotional vocabulary very early on, because one of the best and most adaptive ways to handle your emotions is to first be able to identify them and label them with words. And if we have words for them and we have ways to express them and be heard by other people, we are much more likely to have an effective and adaptive way to handle that than if we're showing it through our behavior and we're, hitting things or biting or spitting food out of our mouth or any of those things that kind of happen at the very, very young ages. So that as early as you can be teaching emotional language and emotion words, the better. I always use this example because it's so good. Disney Pixar several years ago put out the movie Inside Out, and it's a movie all about emotions. And that is an excellent developmentally appropriate teaching tool to teach kids about kind of those basic emotions that we all have. That with my kids, actually, I got them Inside Out. There was a little series of books, and there was one little small board book for each emotion. An easy, developmentally appropriate way to kind of do that early on.
So for those who are listening who may not have those books yet or have watched that movie, what are some of the emotional words or language that we would want to be teaching to our young children?
Yes. So one of the emotions that tend to come into play the most, especially when it comes to food behaviors, tend to be anxiety, fear, anger, and disgust. I mean, sadness comes in, they all come into play, but those are kind of the big ones. So the first thing I think is important is to help kids understand what it feels like to be nervous or anxious. The clinical term is anxious. A lot of people say nervous, but it basically means the same thing. And that there's lots of reasons why we as human beings might feel nervous, and that it's okay to feel nervous. Feeling nervous is okay. It doesn't last forever. It doesn't hurt us. It feels uncomfortable, but it doesn't last forever. So if I'm really excited about something, I might actually feel very similar to when I'm really nervous about something and I'm not sure what's going to happen. Our body actually feels very similarly, but our head interprets it differently. So oftentimes if we're nervous or anxious about something, it can make us really unsure about what to do or whether or not we want to do anything. So nervous eaters tend to be the ones who we have a harder time getting them to eat at all or getting them to eat a wide variety of foods. Anxiety is certainly very tied to that.
Mm-hmm. And I'm certainly seeing quite a bit of that in the more picky eaters that I work with, some of the kids with ARFID that I work with, and it's increasingly becoming an issue, I feel. Or it might be just that I'm attracting more of those clients.
Yeah, well, more attracting it, and also just your awareness building over time that this is how closely connected these things are.
Right. So one of the things you said in your conversation, which I thought was fascinating and it really stuck with me, was all emotions have a function. I think that's such an important concept, even for just parents to understand. It sheds just a brand new light on when you're watching your child melt down or watching your child be really resistant and angry about something. It just sheds a different light. Like, this is an emotion. It has a function. So tell us what you mean by that.
Right. So all emotions have a function. And I would even say all emotions are good emotions. And the reason I say that is because as human beings, we tend to categorize things, and we tend to often not only categorize, but give a value to something as good or bad, right or wrong. And then we tend to label some emotions as good. So that would be happiness, joy, excitement, contentment, that would be on the good list. And then on the bad list is almost everything else, anxiety, fear, shame, disgust, guilt. There's a wide range of them. And the problem with that categorization, while most of us would agree with that categorization, I like feeling some things and I don't like feeling other things, there's very important information you're missing out on if you're not allowing yourself to experience the ones that are on the bad list, quote unquote. I did the air quotes with my fingers, but I realize you can't see me. So our emotions communicate to us. It's our way of our brain and our body kind of connecting together and saying, wait, like, hold on, pay attention. Something's happening here. I'm feeling something because something is happening and I need to respond. So if we disallow or ignore certain emotions because they feel unpleasant or difficult, we're missing out on really important information. And the consequence of that is often then our behavior won't necessarily match the thing that we need to do that's the most helpful. In fact, it'll often propel us to engage in all sorts of behaviors to avoid those emotions. And those are the things that actually get us into pretty big trouble. If I'm really resistant to experiencing anxiety, I might create a world for myself that tries to shield me of it, which on the first gloss sounds like a good idea. Like, I just will never have to feel anxious. But in life, anxiety is a naturally occurring phenomenon for all of us. Some of us more than others. I tend to be I run anxious more so than others, just temperamentally, kind of born that way. And if I spent my whole life avoiding situations where I might feel anxious, my life would be really small. I wouldn't be doing this podcast right now. I wouldn't have the job that I have. I probably wouldn't do a lot of things socially if I allowed anxiety to run the show and say that, okay, like if I can just avoid situations that make me anxious, then that would be great. It just makes your life really small.
So you said something interesting to me, and that was, well, you suggested that perhaps anxiety could be part of the temperament, something that you're sort of hardwired with. And I can see that, in myself as well as some of my children. And that's interesting as well, because then that sort of clues you into the fact that you might, need to help that child a little bit more in terms of their emotional processing.
Absolutely. They will need more because they're so much more sensitive to their emotions than others. I have, 2 children, one of them also very temperamentally similar to me, kind of runs anxious, and the other one not so much. And what I found is, as any parent would when, having multiple children, is that you may have to respond somewhat differently to each of them in order to be most helpful. So recognizing that they have extra emotional sensitivity is really important and really should frame the way that you think about responding when they are experiencing anxiety or panic or, extreme fear that may feel very, disproportionate to what's actually happening. You might be sitting there and being like, this is not a big deal. Why are they freaking out? But if you go to them with that of just get yourself together, stop freaking out. One, that's not so empathic or supportive. And, when you have experiences like that between parent and child over and over and over again, where the child is having strong emotions and they don't feel as if they have any safe place for those emotions to go, that's where larger problems down the road potentially come.
Well, that's so interesting too, because it makes me think of just the emotional sensitivity that goes around that now. But, 10, 20 years ago, I don't want to globally categorize things, but I think we were less sensitive to the emotions of boys decades ago. And I wonder how that, has that ended up playing out in their lives over time. Certainly we're focusing on food and nutrition and eating, but it does beg the thought of, when we suppress or encourage our children to not tune in or recognize, we say, don't cry. You're a boy, don't cry. It just opens up a whole new world, I think, in terms of, wow, that emotional, being in touch with your emotions is very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Very powerful and very important and necessary. So, which is why, I tend to repeat myself on purpose in that, all emotions are good emotions. So it's okay to feel anxious. It's okay to feel afraid. It's okay to feel sad, disappointed, ashamed. All of those things are okay. And as difficult as those things can be to feel that way in that moment, it's that moment. And that moment does not last forever. And that actually, if we allow ourselves to experience that emotion kind of authentically as it comes, when it fits with the situation that's actually happening, we're able to move through it much quicker than if we are constantly trying to stuff it down. Then we actually just repeat the cycle over and over and over again, which actually perpetuates it. So it actually does the opposite of what we want it to do when we suppress it or stuff it.
So when you're talking about let children move through those emotions, for example, can you give us an example of how that might, play out around, food or eating or even something relatable?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have lots of food and eating ones, but the one that's the most relatable to me at the moment, based on my own parenting experience recently, was my daughter really wanted to get her ears pierced. It was her idea. It wasn't my idea. My philosophy from the beginning was she'll get them when she wants them. I'm not going to make the decision for her. And it doesn't really matter to me either way. So she had decided this past summer that before she started school this year, she wanted to go on her first day and have pierced ears. And I was like, great, fine, wonderful. So despite it being her choice, she being my one that runs anxious, had an incredible amount of anxiety and ambivalence about it because part of her really, really wanted it, but another part of her was very scared of the physical pain. She tends to be pretty sensitive to physical pain, and her anticipatory anxiety. So all of the buildup before the day we actually went to the mall to go to, get Claire's and get her ears pierced was, you could see it in all of her behaviors. And because I had been very conscious and aware ever since she was very tiny, teaching her an emotional language, she was talking about, I'm really nervous. I'm really scared about this. I don't know if I want to do it anymore. And that my only real response to her was, it makes sense that you're nervous. This is something that you want to do, but that you're also a little unsure about because you're afraid that it might hurt. And it's okay to be nervous. And the nervousness won't kill you. The nervousness won't last forever. And that probably as soon as you get it done, the nervousness will go away pretty quickly. But until then, yeah, you might feel a little bit nervous, and you can still do the thing that you want to do that's hard and be nervous at the same time. The nervousness doesn't have to go away in order for you to do the thing, which a lot of people think I have to become completely calm and not nervous in order to do the thing that's difficult, whether it be piercing your ears, whether it be a picky eater trying a food that they normally wouldn't try, or any other kind of relatable situation. And the end of the story is she did get her ears pierced. Her anxiety was like peak, really intense anxiety before I continued to give her her choice. It was ultimately still her choice to do it. I wasn't forcing her to do it. She chose to do it. And she said, oh, wow, you're right. As soon as it was over, I realized it wasn't as bad as I made it in my head, which all of us have had that experience. And I was okay, yay, let's get ice cream. Like, let's move on.
Right. Right.
Which I then use that as a learning experience so that in things that have happened since that time, I'll use that as an example. Like, remember when you wanted to get your ears pierced, but you were really nervous about it, and how all the nervousness before was actually worse than the actual event. You remember that? So kind of reminding her of that as she continues to grow as a good example of being kind of scared and doing it anyway, and the sky not falling and her being able to get through it.
So one of the things I'm taking from you is that, this anxiety that a child might feel, but a desire to do something at the same time, they can coexist and probably should coexist.
Yeah. And this is the only way that a generally temperamentally anxious child or adult is going to be able to kind of healthfully, adaptively get through situations moving forward, is that I continue to choose to do things that are outside of my comfort zone along with my anxiety. I know that it's there. It's just kind of part of me, and I can still do it even if I'm anxious.
So it makes me think of some of the extreme picky eaters that I work with, because they are definitely very nervous about trying new food. And they think about the history of what it was like in the past when they tried something new and something bad happened. They vomited, they choked, everybody stared at them, somebody made fun of them. It was unpleasant, and a lot of negative feedback with trying new food. And that's what they remember, that really sticks with them. And so that helps it almost fuels their anxiety in a lot of ways. And so they just don't want to try. They don't even want to come close to having that experience again, or even a semblance of possibly having that experience again. So it sounds like tolerating that anxiety as a parent, I'm thinking through for a parent, how they could manage their child, tolerating that anxiety, recognizing it, talking about it. But ultimately, it's the child's choice, which I've always believed. It's the child's choice whether they're going to try or not. But perhaps helping them deal a little bit more with their negative emotions around that, or their anxiety around that, could be beneficial.
Absolutely. And that the dealing with it, everyone has different ways of dealing with emotions. The way that I'm suggesting to deal with it is to really just acknowledge it for what it is, label it, express it in a appropriate way, not through your behaviors by, again, slamming your fist down or throwing food or spitting or any of those things, but saying, I'm really scared. I'm really nervous. The last time this happened, I ate this food, I threw up and people saw it and I was so embarrassed. Like, we want them to understand the connection between that precipitating and fact that it's now creating a lot of anxiety. They need to understand that in order to then be able to do anything with it. So really just validating, it makes sense that after that was really difficult for you, and it makes sense that now you feel really nervous about doing it again. But it's also important to know that just because it happened then doesn't mean it's going to happen every other time. And we don't really even know unless we try. And that I'm going to try along with you. I'm going to be here with you to support you in it, and that it's okay to be nervous. And if you really want to be able to do this and have this food again, or expand, the amounts of foods that you're having, because typical ARFID kids have a very, very short list of the things that they're willing to have. If they have some motivation because they want to do things that their friends do, they want to be able to, go to a birthday party and eat the food that the other kids eat, or they want to eat in the school cafeteria because that's what the other kids do. Really harnessing that motivational factor that a lot of kids have because they want to fit in and do other things that other kids have, and recognize that you can tolerate being anxious in order to do those things that are valuable and important to you. And that the more that you do it, and do it anxious, do it afraid, and you realize that you can do it and that it maybe wasn't as bad as you thought, or even if it was as bad as you thought, but you got through it, the less intense that anxiety becomes over time. So the things that used to be mountains that seemed insurmountable on a scale of 0 to 10, it was an 11 of like scary and difficult. The more you do it, the less scary it was. So the things that were mountains become molehills. That makes me a little anxious. I still kind of remember when that happened when I had it. But, I know I'll be okay. I've done it enough times now. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And that's kind of the end game of where we would want to get with a very extreme, picky eater or someone that's, diagnosed fully with ARFID.
It's interesting. I have a heart for those kids because I wasn't a picky eater myself, but I equate it when I think in my brain, what is a child who is extremely anxious about trying something new going through? And I think about the time that I went ziplining in Costa Rica, and I'm really afraid of speed. I'm afraid of heights. I did not want to do it, but I promised my family that I would do it. And I had almost debilitating anxiety leading into that experience. And it was not pleasant for me at all going through it. And when I was done, I was like, I'm so glad I'm done with that. I don't have to ever do that again. But I think about children who are so resistant and afraid and who have this super high anxiety. And we'll talk about some other things, but I mean, ARFID obviously isn't just, around the anxiety of trying something new. There can be other things that are feeding into it. But I think about how I felt on that ziplining experience. And I think this is how the kids are feeling too, that are really resistant to trying new food. It's all encompassing. It's physical, it's emotional, it's everything.
Yeah.
But it's not overcomable. I mean, I did it.
You did. You survived. And I think,
Yes.
for parents and professionals, having those examples are really good to help you connect to your empathy when you're in a place where
Yes.
you're feeling a bit impatient, because it's natural for us to feel impatient when you've kind of been at the dinner table so many times and had the same resistance over and over and over again, to connect with that place of that fear and anxiety that you felt before, because that's as real as it feels for them, even if it's not the same experience for you.
I love networking. I'm part of a podcast network called Parents on Demand, or the Pod Network. We are a network of fun and educational podcasts perfect for your family. You can explore the shows in the network by going to parentsondemand.com and searching specific categories. Parents on Demand also has a download for a free network app on iOS and Android, so you can listen to your favorite shows or find new podcasts. Subscribe through iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio, or another provider. Every month, I will feature a podcast that I think will be helpful or of interest to you. Here's this month's podcast feature.
The wait is over and your new baby is here. But it didn't come with an instruction manual. That's why there's Newbies, an audio podcast guiding new mothers through their baby's first year of life. Listen as newly postpartum moms celebrate the excitement of becoming new parents and share the emotional and physical struggles of recovering from childbirth and caring for a newborn baby. Newbies is part of the Parents on Demand network. Look for our free network app in Apple and Android to discover more great parenting shows and listen to your favorite episodes on the go.
So let's talk about emotional regulation. What is it, and what are the signs of somebody who has good emotional regulation?
Right. So emotion regulation is essentially what we've been talking about, is the ability to understand, be aware of all the range of emotions that I have, and to be willing to experience the ones that might be more difficult, but experience them in a way that is proportionate to the actual situation that you're in, and respond accordingly, respond adaptively in a way that makes sense based on the actual situation that's happening. So it's normal to feel anxious at times in anxiety-provoking situations, but it's not so dysregulated that it's off the charts compared to what the actual, threat or difficulty of the situation is. So people who have practiced good emotion regulation skills are aware of their emotions. They understand why they have them and that all emotions are good emotions. They all serve a function. They are able to kind of slow down and think through their then behavioral responses when they feel an emotion. Because a lot of times if someone is dysregulated, emotionally dysregulated, I feel something and then I immediately react and do something. It's kind of that impulsive, just reactiveness. Whereas someone with good emotion regulation can feel something very intensely and can say, ooh, I'm feeling something very intensely. I would really like to just impulsively react right now. And I recognize that that's probably not so helpful. So I'm going to allow myself to be anxious or angry or scared or any of those things. And I know helpful to me in this actual situation versus something that it creates bigger problems for me down the road, which when we're reactive, that creates bigger problems.
And I imagine that requires some maturity level.
Yeah, emotion regulation looks different than an adult, than a child. Well, it should, although I've seen plenty of adults exhibit very, very, very childlike behaviors and poor emotional dysregulation. So a child will developmentally appropriately need assistance from you as the adult to help them regulate. So, some basic suggestions for parents. There's this excellent psychologist that's based out of Canada, Adele LaFrance, and she has developed emotion-focused family therapy. And you don't even need to learn a lot about how the therapy works, but that basically the crux of her therapy is that she teaches parents or caregivers how to be what she calls emotion coaches. And I love that kind of terminology because you really are trying to coach and build a skill within the child that they will then take with them as they grow and develop into adulthood. And she, really drills it down to kind of basic steps. There are 5 steps, but I actually think the first 3 are the only ones you need most of the time. So the first step is to label the emotion. And we already talked about that earlier. So, and sometimes the child doesn't have words for it. So you might help them label it. You don't make assumptions about what it is, but you might ask, like, I noticed that you're feeling, it looks like you're really tense. I can see you, gripping your hands and your fists. Are you feeling nervous? Are you feeling anxious right now? Because sometimes kids just don't know. They know they don't like what they're feeling and they want it to stop. That's where it is. So, maybe helping them figure out what it is. Or I noticed that you're clenching your teeth or your jaw. Are you maybe feeling a bit angry or frustrated or disappointed? So first step is labeling it. The second step is really the first step is attending to it and just noticing. So actually, before you even label it, you attend to it and be like, I notice you might be feeling something right now. So meaning attend to it and notice it versus ignore it. Okay. Then you label it and then you validate it. I can see that you're right. You are feeling really anxious right now. I can see why you would feel this way. This is something that's really new for you, or this is something you've been afraid of before, or that didn't work out so well before. I can see why you're feeling anxious. And it's okay to feel anxious and validate it. That in and of itself, as simple as it is, can go a really long way in the starting of a conversation or an intervention, if you will, as a parent. Because if you start at that place of attending to their emotion, labeling it and validating it, you're sped off on a much better foot than if you are dismissive of the emotion, ignoring the emotion, or shaming of the emotion. Like, why are you feeling this way? Like, just get over it. Like, you're such a baby. Those things that, all of us as parents at times have, when we're sleep deprived and busy and stressed about our own lives, are things that we might naturally be inclined to think or say, it usually doesn't tend to be helpful and get the child to respond in the way that we want.
Yeah, when you said validate, I was like, ooh, that's a good one.
And validate it. And here's the thing, it's a good one, but it's a hard one because sometimes we don't agree or I wouldn't be feeling this way in the same situation, which is why, your example of the ziplining in Costa Rica is so good. That story kind of reminds you of your empathic place of how difficult it can be to be experiencing strong emotions. So you have to kind of connect with your empathy place, which sometimes means you got to dig real deep, especially when your kid is acting really out of difficult, or you're really, past the point of your best version of you, patient parent. So you really got to dig deep and validate it, even if it doesn't make sense. And a lot of times, especially with young children, it doesn't make sense. My child will cry late at night because she's tired about things that have never happened or might happen 10 years in the future that have absolutely nothing to do with what's happening right now at bedtime. It doesn't make any sense, but the emotion and the tears she's feeling right then are real. So, and I have to remember that even though I just want her to go to bed because I want to go to bed too, I have to remember that she is actually, I can see it on her face. I can see it in her little body that she's experiencing that emotion. And I would just say, I can see you're feeling really upset about that right now. And it's okay to be nervous. Being nervous doesn't last forever and it doesn't hurt you. Some variation of that is usually the start. And sometimes that's all that you need. Believe it or not, you don't actually have to swoop in and fix any situation. It might just feeling validated for us as human beings, whether we're small or fully grown, is incredibly powerful and impactful. And we often don't get it or give it enough.
Ooh, amen. That's great. Now, when you gave the example of your daughter feeling anxiety and crying, what other ways do children respond to their emotions? I know we've talked about anger and banging the fist, but for parents out there who may be new to this concept and just learning about it, what sort of behaviors predict some of the common emotions that children might be experiencing?
Well, and certainly around, mealtime would be food refusal or just you've offered your kid like 6 options and none of them are acceptable, pushing the food away, pushing it around on the plate, throwing it, becoming just disruptive in ways that for not an obvious reason, like getting up out of the chair, moving the chair, just refusing to kind of sit. We could see just complete shutting down, just like frozen and like pretty kind of numb and expressionless, kind of the head drawn down and just not really being very expressive, emotive, or active at all. Tears come a lot because tears can come from sadness, but tears a lot of times come from fear and from anxiety. So we can get confused as grown-ups sometimes because we see tears and we think sad, but tears very much come when scared.
That's a good point. And anger.
A lot. And tummy aches, having tummy aches or headaches or other physical complaints that you're not necessarily sure. One, they may not be real. It might be an avoidance of like, I have a tummy ache, I can't eat. Or, again, if you're someone that kind of runs anxious, you're very sensitive to your bodily sensations. That includes digestion. And so really anxious people, kids and adults, can very much, very real feel stomach discomfort, nausea, queasiness. All of those things can be things that people really do physically feel when they're experiencing anxiety or fear.
And so when I'm thinking about food and eating in children, and I think about, how their emotions could be playing into it, I'm thinking of a spectrum of, you've got on one end, the kids who shut down and don't eat at all or tightly control their eating. Cause I'm thinking, eating disorders and dysfunctional eating, ARFID, picky eating, sort of like controlling the eating on one end. But then there's the other end of eating too much, pacifying themselves with eating. How do those eating behaviors actually work to help them feel better, like to regulate their emotions?
And the reason why they're so difficult to change is because they work so well. So there's a psychological principle called negative reinforcement. So even if you don't have a psychology background, you've probably heard of positive reinforcement, right? We're going to reward someone for the behavior that we want to have. So we'll give them a cookie or a sticker or whatever for doing the thing that you want to do. And it feels good. And that's positively reinforcing. Now, the reverse, which is a trickier concept, but it's absolutely the thing that's at play here, is negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement within all humans are driven by this. Good feeling we get when you take something bad or unpleasant away. A parallel, certainly for adults, is, adults who are feeling really anxious, stressed, depressed, might use alcohol or drugs in order to feel better. And oftentimes it may not even feel good. Most people who experience and struggle with substance abuse and substance dependence won't tell you that they feel good. But when they use, they feel less bad. And less bad is good enough in that moment for your brain and that cycle to repeat itself, because your brain is always seeking that short-term relief or that short, quickest Band-Aid solution to feeling better. It can be very numbing to not eat. So if I'm feeling really, really anxious, if I am not putting anything in my body, my ability to feel all of my emotions, good or bad, kind of numbs out a little bit. And that's what we see kind of overall in a pattern for folks with anorexia. For younger children who have that high, ARFID, or have that high sensitivity to their own like digestion and stomach discomfort, maybe they've had past experiences where they vomited a food, or they had diarrhea that wasn't controlled, or they choked on something. The anxiety that comes up is so extreme that they will not want to have that anxiety, thus will not, eat the food. For kids that have not had a good emotional vocabulary and have not really developed internal skills to regulate their emotions, they're feeling really dysregulated. They may have found that food helps them feel a little bit better because of that. Society tells us that. Society tells us to not eat food, and society also tells us to eat food. It's very confusing. People will say things that very much promote the idea of like, here, reward yourself, eat to feel better. And at the same time, they're like, oh, it's bad to eat things. You shouldn't eat things like that. It's bad. So all in the same sentence. So it starts often in childhood to seek food as a comfort because it's the one thing that's like available and reliable, and it'll kind of work pretty immediately. And it's so visceral, right? Because it's all of our senses. We're tasting, we're smelling, we have it on our hands, and that is on a very primitive level, comforting and soothing. And that might be the only thing they've got in their toolbox. So then we see this habitual overeating or binge eating just become a cycle, which is, again, that's that negative reinforcement cycle, that good feeling you get from taking something bad or unpleasant away. And the bad or unpleasant is usually an emotion. I want to take my anxiety away. I want to take my self-doubt away.
Are there certain characteristics within an individual that might, make them more susceptible to, emotion regulation issues and or eating problems?
Yes, absolutely. There's lots of different things that could kind of predispose someone to this. The first and the thing that we can't do anything about is genetics. So that's just something we know, that our gene expression impacts kind of a lot of things, including our temperament. So those who are kind of, again, come out of the womb kind of more anxious, more sensitive, more highly reactive, like you think of like colicky babies. I had one colicky baby, I had one not colicky baby, worlds of difference in the baby experience, for sure. And not surprisingly, the one that was colicky is the one that tends to be more anxious now. So it kind of really, is pretty stable often over lifetime. So anxious temperaments, those who tend to have a harder time separating from a parent, like having a hard time with daycare drop off, a hard time with staying with grandparents, and feeling more anxiously attached to their primary caregivers, tend to be a bit more predisposed to emotion dysregulation and thus eating. Family environments that are really highly rigid about food certainly impacts things and can go in both directions, in that a family might be highly rigid about food, which makes the child highly rigid about food, and they're very, restrictive and limited in their intake. And that also can have the reverse effect, in that the child then is clamoring for everything that they've never been allowed to have because they've been so deprived of variety and things. You kind of see it swing in both directions. But overall, kind of rigidity within the family system or within the child themselves certainly can predispose as well.
So parents should really sort of be on the lookout for this in their children, not like thinking, oh my gosh, I have a child like this, but be aware that this may exist in their children. And what would you suggest for parents, all parents sort of globally in terms of helping their children develop, more positive coping mechanisms or more of a tolerance for all emotions?
Well, and it all boils down to all the things that we've kind of been saying. It's actually it's not simple to do, but it's simple in concept and in principle, which is really you're trying to teach emotional intelligence. It doesn't happen naturally. So in order to be emotionally intelligent, you want to have an awareness that you have emotions, an awareness that there's a reason you have emotions, that all emotions have a function and a purpose. They're neither good nor bad. As your parent, my job is to kind of guide you through this life and support you in experiencing these big emotions, especially when you're experiencing them for the first time. And that, I can be here to kind of coach you through it because I've lived through a lot myself. And I've made it to adulthood, that the more that you can get your kids talking about emotions and their emotions, like I feel disappointed. Like I really wanted to go to Chuck E. Cheese today. Like I love it when my youngest, who still has that kind of cute babyish voice, will say like, "Mommy, I am really disappointed because I wanted to go to Chuck E. Cheese today and you said maybe, and then we didn't, and I'm really disappointed and I'm a little bit angry at you." It's like so cute because it comes out of her little voice. Whereas when my older one would do it, she'd say an eye roll and it wouldn't be as cute. But I would much prefer that because that's genuine, that's transparent, that is accurate to what she's experiencing. I would much prefer that than her throwing herself on the floor, refusing to get up, screaming, all of these things, because she has a language to tell me and I can then take it and not punish her for it or shame her for it. That creates a much better dynamic, not only between us, but just in her ability to then translate that sort of dynamic to other relationships as she grows with her friends and with her teachers and other people in her life, to be able to say, this doesn't feel good to me right now. I feel anxious. I feel nervous. I feel disappointed. I feel upset. Just really aligns itself with a different set of behaviors than just not having words for it and just knowing, I don't like it. Which is where we see those big, more explosive things. So,
yeah. And I guess for parents who may not be emotionally intelligent themselves, there's some work to do there.
But there are really a lot of good, free, web-based resources on, I would just, I love Dr. Google, not for medical information, not in the place of a registered dietitian, not in the place of a therapist, but for just general, like consumer information. Things that you might want to search would just be emotional intelligence. Like, how do I teach emotional intelligence in my toddler or in my preschooler, in my elementary age child? Schools are getting better-ish in that there have been a lot of like initiatives within school systems to include emotional intelligence education as part of their curriculum. It's slow and it's certainly not everywhere. And I realize this is broadcast all over. But it does exist, and I do believe that trend, kind of similar to the trend that we were talking about earlier when we're saying that we're finally starting to recognize that, oh, wait, boys have emotions too, and we shouldn't shame them for that. I do think that it's kind of coming along in concert with that. So there are lots of resources that are available to you through the good old internet, just on like kind of basic, kind of supporting your own understanding of what it means to have an emotionally intelligent child and what are behaviors I as a parent can do to support that.
Oh, that's so great. And I encourage any listener out there who hasn't explored that topic to do it, because I think it enlightens and enriches your parenting experience. Anything else you'd like listeners to know about emotion regulation, and how it's tied to eating?
I mean, I think the other piece is that, we want all parents to get up to speed on emotional intelligence in general, but that we also know that not all kids are the same. And that some kids are more sensitive than others, and some are way more sensitive than others. Sometimes you need more help. And that, seeking professional help when it gets to a place where you don't feel like you have the skill set to really support your child in the way they need, and doing that earlier rather than later. Early intervention in literally any problem, whether it be a medical problem, a behavioral problem, an eating problem, all the research in the world is going to tell you that early intervention is best and is going to give you or your child the best chance of having a good outcome from that experience. So if it means reaching out to a therapist for yourself or your child and not waiting until the problem becomes so catastrophic that like your life is, kind of turned upside down. and not waiting. And it's okay to ask for help as parents because no one teaches us how to do these things.
So I have a surprise question for you. If you're
game. I will recognize that I'm anxious about the surprise question, but I can do it anyway.
You got this. You got this. What does it mean to you to be nourished?
Well, what I would say is that it doesn't just mean being nourished in the physical way, although I think that is essential and important. I think of nourishment often in we've been talking about emotions, but that's my bias, I guess, emotional way, like being filled up. So when I think about my relationships with other people, when I think about my experiences, I often kind of evaluate them as, does it fill me up or does it like deplete me or take away from me? Whether that's my energy level physically, emotionally, relationally, and that I always want to be moving towards things that nourish me or fill me up. So that includes the foods that I fuel my body with. That includes the way that I move my body so that I can because the more you move, the more you keep moving. And that very much, and most importantly, includes the way that I nourish myself as far as my own relationships and emotions. And being an anxious person and an introvert, as much as I need emotional connection and relational connection, I do need it in a different way than other people. So I also need time to recharge and recoup, which doesn't necessarily involve other people. And that nourishes me as well.
It's so interesting to ask that question because it's different for everyone. And it's good. It's good to think about what, as you said, fills you up versus depletes you. So where can listeners find you, Melanie, and get in touch with you if they want to or need to?
So my professional role is at the Renfrew Center, which is an eating disorder treatment center, but that's not the only thing that I kind of do. But if you Google me, Melanie Smith, my credentials that you would find, because Smith is the most common last name, LMHC, that stands for Licensed Mental Health Counselor. If you put in those two things together, you will find me. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't have a website or anything like that because I work for an organization. I don't have a private practice because this keeps me busy enough because this is my favorite thing to talk about.
Yeah, well, you're very good at it. I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing really just great, lovely information that I think many parents will benefit from. Okay, folks, this is definitely one of my all-time favorite episodes, probably because I have a high interest in the topic, but I also learned so much myself from Melanie. I really enjoyed the conversation with her. Every kid has emotions, and emotions are not bad. Emotions are there for a reason. They're there to tell us something. They don't need to be controlled or stuffed or hidden. We have to help our kids recognize their emotions and learn to manage and cope with them in healthy ways. That's our job as parents. Sometimes, though, we even have to get a handle on our own coping skills and emotions so that we can help our kids do the same. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Melanie today and this very important topic. Be sure to check her out over at the Renfrew Center and see the work they do to help kids and their families. As you know, the Nourished Child is a free resource of nutrition and feeding education. You can find even more information over on my website and my blog, www.jillcastle.com. If you want to hear more, be sure to subscribe to this show on Apple Podcasts or on one of your favorite Android apps. Up next on The Nourished Child, I talk about helping kids try new foods. I hope you will tune in. But for today, I'm so happy you joined me. Be sure to give the child in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.